Hello everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Let me know in the comments. If you enjoy our stories, please like the video and subscribe for more. And now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. My name was Elliot, and I was 41 years old. I was an accountant at a downtown agency, and I led a life anyone would describe as orderly. I had fixed schedules, up-to-date invoices, and a place for everything. I always thought order was what kept me safe until I found a briefcase containing an order much older and much more terrible than mine. I found it one January Sunday in the communal storage room of my building. I had been wanting to go down for months to organize mine, because it had become a chaotic warehouse of boxes I had not opened since I moved. The communal storage room was in the basement, a large room with a low ceiling and white-painted concrete walls that had turned gray over the years. The space was divided into wire mesh compartments with padlocks, each assigned to a neighbor. Mine was at the back next to the wall where the heating pipes made a constant noise that sounded like the pulse of a huge animal sleeping behind the concrete. The basement light came from old fluorescent tubes that flickered from time to time and tinted everything a color between white and green that made things look older than they were. I spent the morning taking out boxes, sorting what was useful and what was not, and filling trash bags with objects that had lost their purpose years ago. There were clothes that no longer fit me, books I was not going to read again, and cables for electronic devices that no longer existed. It was while I was moving a metal shelf to access the boxes at the back that I saw it. It was on the floor behind the shelf, pushed against the wall, covered by a layer of dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. It was a black leather briefcase with brass clasps. It was not mine, and I had never seen it. I had been living in that building for 7 years and had never noticed anything behind that shelf. It was possible it had belonged to a previous neighbor, or someone had left it there forgotten years ago. The dust suggested it had been in that position for a long time, motionless and waiting. I took it out and rested it on a box to examine it. The leather was aged but intact, with no cracks or peeling, possessing that patina quality objects acquire when they age well. It had a braided leather top handle and 2 side straps that were loose. The brass clasps were darkened by oxidation, but they worked. I opened them with a dry click that echoed in the silence of the basement like a snap of fingers. I lifted the lid. Inside there were documents, not many. There was a beige cardboard folder with about 20 loose sheets of thick, yellowish paper, the kind used in offices decades ago. Each sheet had text typed with an old typewriter. The typography was irregular, with some letters marked more heavily than others, the letter O slightly misaligned upwards, and the E with a bottom stroke a little thicker than normal. It was the kind of imperfection that differentiates mechanical from digital and turns each page into a unique object. I took the sheets out and spread them on the box. Each document had the same format. At the top there was a date written in numbers. Below that there was a full name. And below the name there was a brief description of an event. That was all. There was no letterhead, no signature, no logos, and no stamps. Just the date, name, and event. The description never exceeded 3 lines. It was brief, precise, with no adjectives or opinions. It was the language of someone who records facts, not someone who narrates them. I read the first documents hoping to find something to help me understand what this was. The first document had a date from the previous month of December. It had a name I did not recognize, and a description saying something about a fire in a warehouse in the industrial area, caused by a short circuit in the electrical panel. The second document had a date from 2 weeks ago. It had another unknown name, and a description of a flood in a commercial basement causing structural damage and forcing the business to close for 3 months. The third had a date from 3 days ago, a name and a description of a traffic accident in a roundabout leaving the driver with back injuries. Up to that point, there was nothing special. They looked like bureaucratic clippings, reports from some municipal archive or insurance company. They were documents someone had compiled for reasons that escaped me. What made me stop was the fourth document. The date was the following Tuesday, 2 days away. The name was Gladys Merton. The description said a gas leak in her home would cause an explosion at 11:40 in the morning. I read the document 3 times. I ran my finger over the typed date as if touching it could verify it was real. The ink was sunk into the paper with the force of a mechanical typewriter. The date was future. It was not past. It was future. I checked the rest of the documents with my hands growing colder despite the suffocating heat of the basement. 8 of the 20 had dates that had not yet arrived. They were events that had not happened to people who had nothing happened to them yet. I took the briefcase up to my apartment and left it on the living room table. I spent the rest of Sunday searching the internet for the names and events of the documents with past dates. The warehouse fire had happened. I found it in a brief news item from a local newspaper, barely a lost paragraph in the events section. The date matched, and the name on the document matched the warehouse owner mentioned in the news. The commercial basement flood had also happened. I found a post on the social network of a local business announcing a temporary closure due to water damage. Same date, same name. I found the roundabout accident in a police report published online on a traffic page. Exact date, exact name, and back injuries. Every document with a past date described a real event that had happened exactly as described, with no errors or approximations, and with a precision leaving no room for coincidence or interpretation. On Tuesday, I arrived at the office with a knot in my stomach that kept me from eating breakfast. At 11:40 in the morning, I was looking at the computer screen seeing nothing, with my fingers on the keyboard and my mind elsewhere, waiting for something I did not know how to expect. At 12, I searched for local news on the internet and found nothing about any explosion or gas leak. At 1, I checked the social networks of local media and found nothing. At 2, I searched again and found nothing. I thought maybe the document was wrong, that maybe whatever generated those papers was not infallible. I felt a timid relief resembling hope. But when I got home at night and turned on the television while making dinner, there it was. The presenter was talking about a gas leak explosion in a residential building. A seriously injured woman was identified as Gladys Merton, 63 years old. The incident had occurred at 11:40 in the morning. The news included images of the building with blown-out windows and firefighters working among rubble and smoke. I felt the living room floor tilt beneath my feet. I sat on the couch and looked at the briefcase on the table with a mix of terror and fascination that churned my stomach and dried my mouth. That night, I reviewed the remaining documents with future dates. The next event was scheduled for Friday of that same week. A man named Tobias Kramer. Broken scaffolding at a construction site at 14 hours and 15 minutes. I waited until Friday with the anxiety of someone who knows something is going to happen and can do nothing to prevent it. Every hour that passed was 1 hour less to the confirmation of something my rational mind refused to accept, but the facts were mercilessly demonstrating. On Friday at 2:15 in the afternoon, I searched for news with sweat dampening my hands on the keyboard. At 3, I found a headline in a local media outlet. Collapsed scaffolding at a downtown construction site. 1 injured worker. Tobias Kramer, 37 years old, fractured tibia and ribs. The document was right again, with the same surgical precision as the previous ones. It was then I decided to try to change something. The next document was dated Wednesday of the following week. A woman named Irene Blackwell falling down the stairs of her home at 9:30 in the morning. If the documents predicted the future, maybe I could use them to prevent that future from coming true. I searched for Irene Blackwell on the internet and found her on a social network. She lived in my city and worked as a high school teacher. She had photos with her students, her family, and a tabby cat appearing in many of her posts. She was a real person with a real life that was going to go wrong on a Wednesday at 9:30 in the morning. I sent her an anonymous message telling her to be careful with the stairs in her house, mentioning a structural risk, and asking her to please use the elevator for a few days. The message sounded ridiculous and paranoid, and I knew it, but it was the only thing I could think of. I spent the weekend waiting, hoping my message was enough to bend the straight line of that typed destiny. On Wednesday at 10 in the morning, I searched for news. At 11, I found what I feared. Irene Blackwell, 51 years old, was admitted to the hospital after falling down the stairs at her home at 9:30 in the morning. The document had been fulfilled. My warning had been useless. The future written on those yellowish sheets could not be modified. That night I went down to the storage room with the intention of returning the briefcase where I found it. If I could not change what the documents predicted, at least I could walk away from them. I wanted to stop knowing, stop waiting, and stop searching for news with my heart in my throat and my hands trembling on the keyboard. I walked down the basement stairs clutching the briefcase to my chest as if it were an animal that could escape. The fluorescent lights flickered with their greenish hue, and the noise from the pipes was louder than usual, as if the basement was more alive at night than during the day. I unlocked my compartment and placed the briefcase behind the shelf in the exact spot I found it. I pushed it against the wall until the leather touched the concrete. I moved the shelf to cover it. I locked the padlock and double-checked that it was secure. I went up to my apartment, made a dinner I barely touched, and went to bed early, hoping everything would return to normal the next day. I woke up at 3 in the morning. It was not a noise that woke me, but a sensation. It was a change in the bedroom air. A temperature drop that gave me goosebumps on my arms under the duvet, as if someone had opened a window to the winter. But the windows were closed and the curtains were still. I sat up in bed and turned on the nightstand light. The briefcase was on my bedroom floor next to the door. The brass clasps were open and the lid was raised. I had left it in the basement less than 5 hours ago. I had locked the storage room padlock and taken the elevator up 8 floors. And the briefcase was in my bedroom, open like a mouth waiting to be fed. There was no dust on its surface, not a single speck. It was as if it had traveled from the basement without touching the floor, without brushing the walls, and without passing through the dirty air of the building. I got up with trembling legs and approached it. Inside was the cardboard folder with the documents. It was the same 20 sheets. But there was something new. There was a sheet that was not there before, placed on top of the others as if wanting to be the first to be read. I took it out with cold fingers and held it under the nightstand light. The format was identical to the others with date, name, and event. But the date was from that very morning at 3:12. That was less than 10 minutes ago. The name was mine, Elliot Dane. And the description said to find the document. That was all. There was nothing else. It did not describe an accident or a catastrophe. It described what I had just done, and what I was doing at that very moment. The briefcase knew I was going to find that document, because the briefcase had written it for me to find. I left the sheet inside the briefcase and closed the lid with hands so shaky the brass clasps took me 3 tries. I took the briefcase to the living room and left it on the table. I sat on the couch and stared at it for the rest of the night without touching it, without opening it, and without blinking more than necessary. When dawn broke, I felt a brief relief that evaporated as soon as I approached the table and saw the clasps were open again. I had not touched them and had been watching them from the couch all night. But they were open, and the lid was raised. Inside was another new sheet. The date was that morning at 6:42. The name was mine again. The description said to read the following document. I looked at the living room clock and it was 6:42. It was giving me instructions instead of predictions, and I was following them by reading them, trapped in a loop where every act of reading confirmed the prediction that anticipated it. I looked under that sheet and found another one. The date was the next day and my name was there again. The description was different from all the previous ones. It did not mention a specific event. It said to stop trying to close the briefcase. From that moment on, I left the briefcase open on the living room table. I did not dare to close it, move it, or return it to the basement because I knew it would appear again in my bedroom, in my kitchen, or under my pillow. The documents kept appearing. Every morning there was a new sheet inside the folder that was not there the night before. I never saw how they arrived. I never heard the sound of a typewriter or the rustle of paper sliding over the cardboard. They simply appeared, as if the ink materialized on the paper during the hours I slept, if I slept at all. Because every night it was harder to close my eyes knowing there would be a new document waiting for me, with my name at the top when I opened them. The new documents were divided into 2 types. Some followed the original format of date, someone else's name, and event. They were predictions of things that were going to happen to other people, like accidents, illnesses, and losses. They were nothing fatal, but always painful, always precise, and always inevitable. I had already stopped looking at the news to confirm them. I knew they would come true and needed no verification. The other type of documents were the ones mentioning me. These did not predict accidents or illnesses. They described my daily actions with a precision eliminating any illusion of free will. The document stated Elliot got up at 7:14. It said Elliot drank his coffee looking at the briefcase for 9 minutes. It detailed Elliot arrived at work 4 minutes late because he stopped at the lobby to check the mailbox. It mentioned Elliot thought about getting rid of the briefcase at 15:22, but did not do it. Every description came true to the second. Every action I performed was written on a paper that had appeared while I slept. My entire life had become a script written by a non-existent typewriter inside a briefcase I could not abandon. I tried to break the pattern. I set out to do something the documents had not predicted. One morning, instead of going to work, I turned left instead of right when leaving the building. I walked in the opposite direction of the office, aimlessly and with no plan, just to prove I could make a decision not written on any paper. I walked for 2 hours through unfamiliar streets, entered a coffee shop I had never been to, ordered a tea I do not usually drink, sat by the window, and watched the street with the temporary satisfaction of someone who believes they have broken a chain. When I returned home at noon, I opened the briefcase with sweating hands. The document from that morning was there. It stated Elliot turned left when leaving the building, walked 2 hours through the west neighborhood, entered the coffee shop on Market Street, ordered a green tea, sat by the window, and returned home at 12:23. Every detail was correct. Even my attempt at rebellion was foreseen, and my act of freedom was part of the script. The briefcase started generating changes in my apartment that went beyond the documents. I found them in the mornings, subtle at first and obvious later. One night I left a glass of water on the kitchen counter, and upon waking it was on the living room table next to the briefcase, as if someone had moved it while I slept. The books on the shelf would appear in a different order than I had left them, with their spines forming a sequence that made no sense, until I realized the first letters of each title spelled words I refused to read completely. Lights I turned off before bed would be on at dawn. One morning I found my desk chair turned toward the briefcase, as if someone had been sitting there during the night looking at the documents, reading them, or perhaps writing them. I checked the door locks and they were intact. I checked the windows and they were locked. I put a glass with coins against the front door to make noise if someone opened it during the night. In the morning, the coins were inside the briefcase, stacked on top of the documents in a perfect column that could not have formed by accident. There were 11 coins, one on top of another, without a single millimeter protruding. It was as if someone had placed them with a precision beyond human capability. The ink on the documents also started behaving impossibly. One afternoon, I grabbed one of the old documents, a past-dated one about the warehouse fire, and brought it close to the desk lamp to examine it in more detail. The letters moved. It was not visible to the naked eye, but when I focused my gaze on a specific word, the surrounding letters shifted a millimeter like insects moving away when you bring your finger close. I blinked, and the letters were in place. I focused on a word again, and the neighboring letters moved again, this time further and faster with a movement that seemed deliberate and almost defensive. It was as if the text were alive and did not like being looked at too closely. I let go of the paper and took a step back. The document fell on the table, and the letters rearranged themselves for a fraction of a second before becoming fixed. But the sentence they formed was no longer the same. Where it previously stated the name of a person and the description of a fire, it now said to stop looking. I stood by the table with my heart pounding against my ribs for a full minute before daring to touch another document. I did not touch it. I never examined any paper closely again after that. I started losing weight. It was not because I stopped eating, but because anxiety consumed me from the inside, like a slow acid dissolving everything that previously gave me stability. I slept no more than 3 hours a night. Every morning I woke up with the certainty there would be a new document, and every morning that certainty was confirmed. My eyes sank into their sockets, and my skin clung to my cheekbones as if my body were shrinking inward. My boss called me to his office to ask if everything was okay. I told him I was having trouble sleeping. My coworkers looked at me with that uncomfortable concern of someone who wants to help, but does not know how and prefers not to insist. I could not tell them the truth. I could not explain my life was being written night after night by something living inside a black leather briefcase. and that every day the script grew more detailed, intimate, and invasive. I could not tell them it knew every decision I was going to make before I made it, and knew every thought before it formed in my head. A week ago, I found a document different from all the previous ones. It was at the bottom of the folder under the others, as if it had been hidden or appeared there without the other documents moving to make room for it. The format was the same with date, name, and event. The date was a month from now, and the name was mine. But where there should be a description of the event, the sheet was blank. It was an empty space after my name and the date. There were no words, no prediction, and no instructions. It was just a rectangle of yellowish paper with my name at the top and a void underneath that weighed more than all the words from all the previous documents combined. I held it up to the light looking for some invisible mark or some impression that would only reveal itself at a certain angle. There was nothing. The paper was clean and the space was empty, but it was not the emptiness of an unused page. It was the emptiness of a page that was waiting. I did not know what that blank space meant. I did not know if it meant nothing would happen that day, or if it meant what would happen was so immense that not even the invisible typewriter dared to put it into words. What I did know was that every morning when I woke up and approached the briefcase, the date on the blank document was one day closer. And every morning the empty space under my name seemed a little larger, as if the paper were stretching to make room for something that had not yet been written but was already on its way. The briefcase remained open on my living room table. The brass clasps shone with a luster they did not have when I found it, as if every new document fed it, and every fulfilled prediction made it stronger, more present, and more real. The previous night before going to bed, I sat in front of it and stared at it for a long time. And for the first time, I noticed something I had not seen before. On the inner lining of the briefcase, sewn into the leather with black thread and almost invisible, there was a list of names. There were dozens of names written in tiny letters. The first ones were illegible and worn by time. The last ones were clearer, and the last name on the list, sewn with thread that still shined, was mine. Sometimes I thought the blank space was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen, because words, no matter how terrible, at least let you prepare. The void gave you nothing but the certainty that something would occupy it, and I had the growing suspicion that when that space was filled, I would not be there to read it. In the end, I realized that the most profound horror lay not in the preordained script of our demise, but in the silent, empty pages waiting patiently to claim our final moments as their own. I have never had vision problems, not near or far. 27 years with perfect vision with no need for checkups or prescriptions. That is why it is ironic that everything started precisely with a pair of glasses. I bought them at a pawn shop downtown, one of those narrow and deep stores where objects are piled up in dusty display cases with no apparent order. I had gone in looking for a birthday gift for my roommate, something original, something that could not be found in a normal store. I saw them on a tray next to some silver cufflinks and a wristwatch without a strap. They had a round metal frame with a golden tone darkened by time. The lenses did not seem to have a prescription. I held them up to the light and did not notice any distortion. The clerk, an older man with a gray beard and a gray apron, told me they had arrived a couple of weeks ago inside a box with other items from an estate sale. He knew nothing else about them. He let me have them for 3 coins. I bought them thinking they would be a curious accessory, something aesthetic, something to wear to look more interesting in my university photos. I tried them on that same night in my room in front of the closet mirror. They looked good on me. The round frame gave my face an antique look that amused me. I left them on while I organized the notes on my desk. The room looked the same through the lenses, without magnification or reduction, which confirmed they had no prescription. I wore them for about 20 minutes before taking them off and leaving them on the nightstand. I did not notice anything strange, nothing at all. The first time was the next day. I had an early class and left home in a hurry, without eating breakfast, with my backpack half open and the glasses on because I had put them on while getting dressed and forgot to take them off. I was walking down the sidewalk towards the bus stop when I saw a woman standing next to a doorway. She looked to be about 50 years old. She wore a dark dress and had her hair pulled back. She was motionless, with her arms glued to her body and her gaze fixed on the ground. What caught my attention was not her posture or her clothes, but that nobody seemed to see her. The sidewalk was crowded at that hour. There were people going to work, students and mothers with strollers. Everyone walked past her without looking at her, without dodging her, without registering her presence in any way. A man with a briefcase passed so close he should have brushed her shoulder. He did not brush against her. He passed through the space she occupied as if there was nobody there. I stopped. I looked at the woman more closely. She had pale skin, a white that did not seem natural, as if she had been out of the sun for a long time. Her features were normal, just an ordinary face, neither young nor old, neither pretty nor ugly. But there was something in her stillness that I found disturbing. People move, always. Even when standing still, they breathe, blink, and shift their weight from one foot to another. That woman did none of that. She was as motionless as a mannequin. I took off my glasses to wipe my eyes, thinking that fatigue was playing tricks on me. When I looked back at the doorway, the woman was not there. I put the glasses back on. She was still not there. She was gone. I kept walking towards the bus stop, trying to convince myself that it had been a distraction, a normal person who had walked away at the exact moment I took off the glasses. But there was something in the image that I could not get out of my head, the way the man with the briefcase had passed through her, not around her, but through her. During the following week, I wore the glasses every day, not because I needed them, but because I liked how they looked on me, and because several classmates had told me they gave me an interesting air. I wore them at the university, in the library, on the bus, and at home. And I started seeing more people like that woman. Not many. 1 or 2 a day, sometimes none. Always on the street, always motionless, and always ignored by everyone. A young man sitting on a park bench next to the faculty building, with his hands on his knees and a blank stare. An old woman standing on a corner in the rain, without an umbrella, not getting wet. A child in a supermarket aisle, barefoot, looking at the wall with his head tilted as if listening to something coming from the other side. They all shared the same unnatural stillness, the same paleness, the same quality of being invisible to everyone but me. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. I looked for medical explanations. I read about visual disorders, about hypnagogic hallucinations that extend beyond sleep, and about Charles Bonnet syndrome. None of the descriptions fit what was happening to me. Hallucinations of that type are usually abstract, geometric, and disconnected from reality. What I saw were specific people, with clothes, with defined facial features, and with a physical presence that occupied a place in space even if nobody else could perceive it. It took me a few days to establish the connection with the glasses. It was an accident. One morning I left home without them because I had left them next to my laptop and did not realize it until I had walked several blocks. That day I did not see any of those figures, not a single one. The city seemed normal, full of real people who moved, talked, breathed, and occupied space in a tangible way. It was such a great relief that I almost burst out laughing in the middle of the street. The next day I put the glasses on before leaving, as an experiment. I had barely walked 2 streets when I saw a middle-aged man standing by a traffic light. He was motionless, pale, and invisible to everyone except me. The pattern was undeniable. With the glasses, I saw them. Without the glasses, they did not exist. The logical reaction would have been to stop wearing them, to put them in a drawer or return them to the pawn shop. But curiosity overcame prudence. I wanted to understand what those people were. Ghosts, hallucinations, or some kind of optical phenomenon caused by the lenses. I began to observe them more closely, making mental notes about their appearance and behavior. They all wore normal clothes from different eras, but with nothing flashy. None had visible wounds or strange marks. None spoke. None moved while I looked at them. They were like 3-dimensional photographs of people frozen in an instant that did not belong to the present. Until one of them looked at me. It was in the faculty library on a Tuesday afternoon. I was on the 2nd floor, at a table by the window, studying for an exam. I had my glasses on. The library was silent, with that dense stillness that places full of books and focused people have. I looked up to rest my eyes and saw a girl standing between the bookshelves in the history section. She looked about my age. She had short hair, a gray sweater, and dark pants. She had the same paleness as always, and the same stillness. She was standing in profile, looking at the spines of the books as if searching for a specific title. I stood watching her for a few seconds, waiting for the moment when someone would walk past her without seeing her to confirm what I already knew. Then the girl turned her head. It was a slow movement, very slow, as if it cost her an enormous effort, as if the air around her were denser than the rest of the room. But she turned her head and looked at me. She did not look vaguely in my direction. She looked at me, right in the eyes, with an expression I can only describe as recognition. It was as if she knew I was seeing her and had been waiting for that to happen. Her lips parted a couple of millimeters as if she were going to say something, but no sound came out. There was only that mute gesture, that mouth opening on a silence that weighed more than any word. My mouth went dry. The pen I was holding fell on the table and the noise seemed deafening in that silence. I looked away and took off my glasses with a sudden movement. When I looked back at the shelves, there was nobody there. There were only the books, the back wall, and the light from the fluorescent tubes reflecting on the polished floor. I sat there with my heart racing and the glasses in my hand for several minutes. A classmate came over to ask me something about the exam, and I had to make a huge effort to answer normally, so my voice would not tremble, and so he would not notice my hands were wet with sweat. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about that gaze, the slow turning of the head, and the mouth opening without making a sound. I thought about the possibility that those figures were not just residual images, but something with a consciousness. They were something that could perceive they were being watched, and had been waiting with infinite patience for someone to see them. From that day on, the behavior of the figures changed. They were no longer motionless when I looked at them. They moved, not abruptly or threateningly. They turned their heads towards me when I passed by. They followed my path with their eyes when I walked down the street. A man I saw by the door of a building raised his hand when I passed in front of him. It was not a greeting. It was a slow, mechanical gesture, as if he were pointing at me, as if he wanted someone to know where I was. Another day, a woman standing by a fountain took a step in my direction when I walked past her. Just one step. Then she stopped. But that step was enough for fear to settle in my stomach like a block of ice that would not melt. I started keeping a log. Every time I saw one of those figures, I wrote down the time, the place, and what they were doing. In 2 weeks, I filled several pages of a notebook. The patterns that emerged disturbed me more than the apparitions themselves. The figures were more frequent at night. They appeared more often in places with few people. And the distance between them and me was shrinking. At first I saw them across the street on opposite sidewalks or on distant corners. Now I saw them a few feet away, on the same sidewalk, or in the same room. I made a graph with the data from the notebook. The line representing the average distance dropped steadily day after day, like a countdown to something I did not want to imagine. I told my roommate Tiago a softened version of what was happening. I told him the glasses caused visual distortions, that I saw spots or blurry figures with them on. He told me the lenses probably had some impurity or an old treatment that altered perception. He suggested I throw them away. I ignored him. I could not explain to him that the figures moved, that they looked at me, that they knew I was seeing them. He would have thought I was losing my mind. Sometimes I thought so myself. I caught myself looking at my hands to check that they were solid, that they were there, and that I still belonged on the side of those who breathe and cast normal shadows. One night, coming home after a late class, I saw 3 figures together for the first time. They were standing at the entrance to the alley I used as a shortcut to get to my building. 3 pale, motionless people blocking the way. There was an older man with his hands crossed in front of his body, a young woman with long hair falling over her face, and someone whose gender I could not determine because they were partially hidden behind the other 2. Showing only half a face as if hiding, or as if wanting me to see just enough to know they were there. All 3 heads turned towards me when I approached. 6 eyes locked onto mine. I stopped about 15 feet away. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The street was deserted. The streetlights hummed with that electrical sound that can only be heard when there is no other noise to cover it. The alley behind the figures was a dark mouth that seemed to swallow the light. I did not take off my glasses. Part of me wanted to see what they would do. The other part was paralyzed by something deeper than fear. It was fascination. It was the same dangerous fascination you feel when you look down from a great height and a part of your brain invites you to take one more step. I stood there holding their gaze for what must have been 30 seconds, but felt like half an hour. The older man tilted his head to one side, like a dog listening to a sound it does not understand. The woman with the long hair raised a hand and reached out to me with an open palm. It was not a threatening gesture. It was an invitation. I took a step back, then another. I turned around and walked in the opposite direction to take a detour down another street. But when I entered the lobby of my building and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, I felt that something had changed. It was as if by stopping in front of them for those seconds I had confirmed something, as if I had given them a piece of information they were waiting for. That night I sat on my bed with the glasses in my hand and examined them carefully for the first time since I had bought them. The frame had tiny marks on the inside of the right temple. They were not random scratches. They were letters. They were very small and engraved in the metal with some precision instrument. I could not decipher the language because the letters did not belong to any alphabet I knew. I ran my thumbnail over the marks and noticed the depth of each stroke and the precision of each curve. Whoever had engraved them had a steady hand and a clear intention. It was not an ornament or a maker's mark. It was a message. I used my phone camera to take an enlarged photo and searched for it online for hours. I tried translators for ancient alphabets, symbol databases, and websites on epigraphy and dead languages. I found no exact match. I uploaded the image to a linguistics forum asking if anyone recognized the writing. Most of the answers were baseless speculation, with people suggesting they were decorative marks or manufacturing defects. But a user replied 2 days later with a message that changed everything. He told me it looked like a funerary writing system used in certain regions of Central Europe during the 18th century. It was writing engraved on objects meant to be buried with the deceased, objects that were supposed to accompany them to the other side. I asked him what the words meant. He said he could not be sure with so little text, but that the rough translation was something like "so they see the way," or "so they find those who see." I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness of my room, without wearing the glasses, looking at the closed door. The second part of that inscription had frozen my blood. "So they find those who see." It was not an instrument for observation. It was a beacon. The glasses did not allow me to see the dead. The glasses allowed them to find me. The next morning I left home without the glasses. I left them in the nightstand drawer under a book as if hiding them would do any good. I walked to the university along my usual route. The morning was cold and gray, with that kind of flat light that flattens shadows and makes everything look a bit unreal. I had walked 3 blocks when I saw something that made me stop in the middle of the sidewalk. There was a man standing by the door of a pharmacy. He was motionless and pale with his gaze fixed on me, and I was not wearing the glasses. I wiped my eyes hard. I looked again. The man was still there. He was not a normal person waiting for the store to open. He had the same quality as always, the same unnatural stillness, and the same invisibility to everyone walking past him. And he was looking at me, without the glasses, without any glass between his eyes and mine. My stomach contracted as if I had been punched. I turned around and walked in the opposite direction, fast, not running, but taking long and urgent steps. I turned a corner and saw another figure. It was a woman standing next to a closed storefront. She looked at me with her head tilted, and that expression of infinite patience I already knew so well. I almost ran back home. I went into my room and opened the nightstand drawer. The glasses were where I had left them. I had not put them on. I had not touched them. But I could see the figures without them. The damage was already done. The glasses had opened something in my perception that could no longer be closed. They were like a door that only works in one direction. The days that followed were the worst of my life. The figures were everywhere. They were on the street, at the university, in the supermarket, and on the bus. There were dozens of them, many more than I had ever seen while wearing the glasses. It was as if word had spread. It was as if they knew I no longer needed the glass to see them, and that had attracted them in droves. I saw them among real people, mixed with the living, occupying spaces that nobody else perceived. and all of them, without exception, looked at me. They followed me with their heads when I passed by. They turned in my direction when I entered a room. Some began to follow me. They walked behind me at a distance of several feet, taking slow and silent steps that made no noise against the asphalt. Sometimes I stopped suddenly and looked back. They were there. They were always there. There would be 2, 3, or 5 pale figures just a few feet away, motionless the instant I turned around, as if they had been walking and had frozen just in time. I stopped going to class. I told Tiago I was sick. I locked myself in my room with the blinds down and the lights on. But the lights were of no use. I saw them anyway, with light or without light, with my eyes open or closed. When I closed my eyes, I saw them as dark silhouettes against the inside of my eyelids. They were motionless human forms, waiting. Sleep became something that happened in short and restless intervals, never more than an hour at a time, and always interrupted by the feeling that someone was standing next to the bed. I tried to destroy the glasses. I put them on the bathroom floor and hit them with a hammer. The frame bent but did not break. The lenses did not crack. I hit them harder. The hammer handle broke before the glasses suffered a single bit of damage. I put them in the oven at maximum temperature for an hour. When I opened the door, they were intact. They were not even hot. I touched them with my fingers and they were at room temperature, as if the oven had not been turned on. The gold metal shone with a luster it did not have before. It was as if the fire, instead of destroying them, had fed them. I went to see the clerk at the pawn shop. I needed to know where those glasses had come from, who had sold them, and who they had belonged to before. The store was open, but the man with the gray beard was not there. In his place was a young woman who told me she was his daughter, and that her father had stopped working 2 weeks ago for health reasons. I asked her about the glasses and the box of items they came from. She checked the records for a long time, turning the pages of a hardcover notebook where they wrote down all the incoming and outgoing merchandise. The box had been purchased at an estate sale of a house whose occupants had died. They were an older couple with no heirs. The address of the house was in the record. I asked her to give it to me. She looked at me strangely, but wrote it down on a piece of paper. I went to the address that same afternoon. It was an old building on a narrow street in the old quarter, with a stone facade darkened by dampness and wrought iron balconies that nobody had maintained for decades. The apartment was empty and for sale, with a real estate agency sign stuck on the second-floor window. I convinced the doorman I was a distant relative of the deceased couple, and he let me go up. The stairs creaked under my feet and smelled of dampness and old plaster. The apartment was on the second floor, at the end of a narrow hallway with loose tiles. I opened the door and went in. The smell hit me first. It was stale and dense, like wet paper and dust accumulated for months. The walls were bare, with the rectangular marks of the paintings that had hung there for years. The furniture had been removed, but the footprints remained on the floor, the marks of the legs on the worn wood. The light entered through the dirty windows in slanted beams that revealed particles floating in the air, as if the house itself were breathing. I walked through the rooms one by one. I saw the kitchen with tiles of an undefined color between green and gray. I saw the living room with a damp stain on the ceiling that spread like a map of a country that does not exist. I saw a small bathroom with the mirror still hanging on the wall, covered in a layer of dust that made it opaque. Everything was empty, covered by that layer of abandonment that settles when a space ceases to be inhabited. But on the floor of the master bedroom, marked with white chalk that time had not erased, there was a circle. It measured a little over 3 feet in diameter. Inside the circle were symbols I did not recognize, but that looked like the letters engraved on the temple of the glasses. Some were partially erased by the footprints of those who had emptied the apartment, but the ones that remained were enough to recognize the same type of strokes, the same angular and precise calligraphy. I kneeled next to the circle and ran my fingers over the symbols. The chalk was embedded in the wood, as if it had been traced over many times, night after night, stroke over stroke, until the grooves had become part of the floor itself. And in the center of the circle, nailed to the wood with a rusty nail, was a piece of yellowed paper with a single phrase written in the same language as the inscription. I took a photo of it and sent it to the same linguistics forum user who had helped me before. His reply arrived that same night. The phrase said that when the one who sees accepts the gaze, The path opens and does not close. I left that apartment feeling like the ground was moving under my feet. I walked down the stairs holding onto the railing and went out to the street. It was night. The streetlights cast pools of yellowish light on the sidewalk, and in every pool of light, motionless, pale, and silent, there was a figure looking at me. I counted 12 before I stopped counting. They were on both sides of the street, forming a kind of hallway. It was a corridor of still bodies with their eyes fixed on me. For the first time, one of the figures smiled. It was the closest one, a young man with light hair and skin so white it seemed luminous under the streetlights. His smile was not warm at all. It was the gesture of someone who has been waiting a long time and finally sees what they were waiting for arrive. I walked among them until I reached the bus stop. They did not touch me. They did not move from their spots. They only followed me with their eyes as I passed through their ranks like someone walking among statues in a museum that has come to life after closing. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes on my skin like physical contact, like cold fingers running down the back of my neck and my shoulders as I moved forward without daring to run, because something told me that running would be worse. It told me that running would be admitting I was afraid, and fear was exactly what they wanted. That was 3 weeks ago. The glasses are still in my nightstand drawer. I no longer need them to see. The figures are always there, at all hours, everywhere. They are on the street, at home, in my room. They no longer keep their distance. They sit in my desk chair while I study. They stand by the window while I try to sleep. They lean against the bathroom wall while I shower. Tiago sees nothing. Nobody sees anything. Only me. I have stopped leaving my room except for the essentials. Tiago thinks I am depressed. He has called my parents. My mother came to see me last week and sat on the edge of my bed for an hour, speaking to me with that soft voice mothers use when they know something is wrong but do not know what. Behind her, standing by the door, were 2 figures looking at me over her shoulder. I did not tell her anything. It would have been of no use. It would only have made her worry more, made her think her son was losing his mind, and made her call doctors and specialists who would ask me questions for which I have no answers that sound reasonable. Yesterday, one of them touched me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder as I walked down the hallway at home towards the kitchen. I turned around and there was nobody visible, but the pressure of the fingers remained for hours, like a freezing mark printed on the skin. There were 5 spots of cold arranged in the exact shape of a human hand that faded throughout the day, but that by nightfall still throbbed like a bruise you cannot see but can feel. This morning I looked in the mirror and noticed something that left me paralyzed for a long time. My skin was paler than normal. Not much, just a shade or maybe 2. It could be insomnia, lack of sun, or the accumulated stress of these weeks. It could be anything. But when I looked into my eyes in the mirror, I saw something in them that I recognized immediately. It was the same stillness, the same fixedness, the same patient expression I had seen in each of those figures since the first time I put on the glasses. And for a moment, just for a moment, I wondered if the person looking back at me from the other side of the glass was still me. In the end, we failed to realize that the windows we open to observe the darkness are the exact same ones the darkness uses to look into us, and sometimes to step through. The house was not perfect, but it was ours. We had been looking for over a year for something we could afford without a mortgage until we were 60, and that was the best option we had found. 2 floors, a small garden, and an attic accessed by a folding staircase in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. It was in the suburbs, in a quiet residential area where the houses were somewhat old, and the neighbors had known each other all their lives. The real estate agent told us the previous owners were a married couple who lived there for over 40 years. The husband had died first and the wife a few months later. They had no children. The house had been empty for almost 2 years when we bought it. My partner, Renata, fell in love with the garden and the light that came through the living room windows. I noticed the structure was solid and the roof had no leaks. We signed the papers in March and moved in early April. The first few days were typical of any move. There were boxes everywhere, half-placed furniture, and mild arguments about where to put the bookcase and whether the couch looked better facing the window or the wall. The house smelled of fresh paint because we had repainted the rooms before bringing our things. It was a clean and hopeful smell that promised a new beginning in a space that would be ours for a long time. We spent those first days focused on the 2 main floors, organizing the kitchen, assembling the bedroom furniture, and hanging curtains and lamps. The house was taking shape little by little, and every room we finished felt like a small victory. At night, exhausted from the physical work, we would sit on the couch to eat dinner while watching a show and fall asleep before 11. Life was simple and full of that quiet excitement that accompanied beginnings. We did not go up to the attic until the second week. There were so many things to organize on the main floors that the attic was relegated to that mental place where we put tasks that are not urgent. It was Renata who pulled the rope that unfolded the stairs on a Saturday afternoon when we had almost finished setting everything up. The staircase came down with a metallic squeak that echoed in the hallway like a moan. Renata went up first. I heard her footsteps on the wooden boards, cautious and spaced out, as if she were testing each board before putting her full weight on it. Then there was silence. She asked me if I could come up. Her voice sounded strange, not scared but confused, as if she had found something she did not expect. I climbed the stairs and poked my head through the trapdoor. The attic was bigger than I had imagined. The ceiling followed the slope of the roof, and there was a small window at the end that let in a dusty golden light. Specks of dust floated in the beam of light like tiny stars suspended in the still air. The space was empty except for an object sitting in the center, right under the highest point of the ceiling. It was a rocking chair. It was made of dark wood, carved with a detail that did not belong to just any piece of furniture. The armrests ended in shapes that looked like claws or twisted roots. The backrest had a design of intertwined branches forming a pattern that hypnotized the eye if you looked at it for too long, as if the branches moved in your peripheral vision, but stopped when you looked straight at them. The seat was worn in the center, sunken by the weight of whoever had sat in it for years. And even though there was no draft in the attic, even though the window was closed and the floorboards were firm, the rocking chair was rocking. It was a subtle, barely perceptible movement, as if someone had just gotten up from it a second before we came up. Renata looked at me, and I looked at her. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then she laughed with that nervous laugh she had when something made her uncomfortable, but she did not want to admit it. She said it was probably due to the vibrations of the floor, that our footsteps climbing the stairs had made the boards tremble and set the rocking chair in motion. It was a reasonable explanation, and I accepted it because I wanted to accept it. We approached the rocking chair and examined it. The wood was in good condition despite its age. It had no maker marks or labels. The joints were handmade without screws or nails, just wooden assemblies fitted together with a precision that spoke of a craftsman who knew what he was doing. Renata ran her hand over the backrest and said it was beautiful, suggesting we could take it down to the living room and restore it. I told her I preferred to leave it where it was for now, that we should finish organizing the house first, and then we would see what to do with it. I did not give her a specific reason, because I did not have one. I just knew I did not want that rocking chair in my living room. Something about the way it rocked for no reason. The darkness of its wood, and the carved claws on the armrests produced an instinctive rejection in me that I could not explain, but could not ignore either. We left it in the attic and went downstairs. That night while we were having dinner, I heard a rhythmic creak coming from the ceiling. It was a soft and constant sound, like the rocking of something heavy on old wood. Renata heard it too. She looked up from her plate and looked at me. I told her it must be the house, that old houses creak due to temperature changes as the wood expands and contracts. She nodded and we kept eating, but the creaking continued throughout the night. I heard it from the bed, rhythmic like a metronome, constant like the breathing of a sleeping person. When I got up at 3 a.m. to go to the bathroom, the sound stopped. It stopped the exact moment I put my foot on the floor. It was as if whatever was rocking upstairs knew I had woken up. I stood motionless on the edge of the bed for a full minute, holding my breath and listening. The silence was absolute. I lay back down and closed my eyes. A few seconds passed and the creaking started again, slow, rhythmic, and patient. Over the following days, the creaking became part of the soundscape of the house. It always appeared at night, always with the same rhythm, and always coming from the attic. Renata stopped mentioning it, and I stopped mentioning it. We got used to it like someone gets used to traffic noise or the hum of a refrigerator. but a part of me registered every rock, every creak, and every pause that coincided with my movements. The rocking chair rocked when we were still, and stopped when we moved. It was as if it needed us to be motionless to do what it did, as if our movement interrupted its own. It was Renata who went up to sit first. She did not tell me. I came home on a Friday afternoon after work and found her on the living room couch, with her hands on her knees staring blankly at a spot on the wall. Her face was pale and her lips were pressed tightly together. I asked her what was wrong, and it took her a few seconds to answer, as if she needed time to find the right words, or to decide how many of those words she was willing to share. She told me she had gone up to the attic to measure the window because she was thinking of putting up a curtain. She said that while she was up there, the rocking chair had stopped moving. It had stopped completely, as if inviting her to sit down, and she had sat down. She did not know why. It was not something she had planned or wanted to do. She simply found herself walking towards the rocking chair and dropping into the seat as if her legs had made the decision without consulting the rest of her body. I asked her what happened next. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. It was fear, but a fear mixed with something resembling shame, as if what she had seen was too intimate to share. She told me that the moment her back touched the backrest of the rocking chair, the room had disappeared. It had not gone dark or transformed. It had simply ceased to exist. In its place appeared an image as clear and real as life itself. She had seen herself in a hospital room she did not recognize, lying in a bed connected to tubes and machines. She had gray hair and skin covered in wrinkles. She was alone. There was nobody else in the room, no family members, no nurses, and no sign that anyone had been there. The machines emitted regular beeps that grew slower until they became a continuous line. A long, flat sound that stretched like an endless horizon. And then the image had turned off like a disconnected screen, and she was back in the attic sitting in the rocking chair, with her heart pounding in her chest and her hands gripping the armrest so tightly she had the marks of the carved claws imprinted on her palms. She showed me her hands. The marks were there, red and deep in the exact shape of those wooden claws. I told her it had been a hallucination, that maybe the dust in the attic had caused some kind of reaction, and that the lack of ventilation could cause dizziness and visions. I did not believe a word I was saying, and neither did she. But we needed to say something that sounded rational, so we would not have to accept what we both knew. That night I held her in bed and felt her trembling against my body, a fine and constant tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. That night the creaking from the attic was louder than ever. It was not the gentle rocking of the previous nights. It was a wide, aggressive movement, as if the rocking chair were swinging with all the force a rocking chair can generate. The ceiling boards shook with every sway, and the sound made the air in the room vibrate as if the whole house were breathing to the rhythm of that rocking. Renata curled up next to me in bed and squeezed my arm tightly. We did not speak. We stayed like that, listening to that furious rhythm for hours until it stopped abruptly just before dawn, as if the rocking chair had grown tired or had finished what it was doing. I should have gone up and broken that rocking chair. I should have taken an axe from the garage and turned it into splinters, but I did not do it. Instead, I did something I cannot explain with logic or common sense. I waited for Renata to go to work the following Monday and went up to the attic. The rocking chair was motionless. The light from the window hit it from the side and cast the shadow of the backrest branches onto the wooden floor like a drawing of black veins spreading across the boards in all directions. I approached slowly. The attic smelled of old wood and something else, something sweet I had not noticed before, like resin or sap from a tree that has been cut down for a long time but is still bleeding. I sat down. The seat was cold, even though the attic was warm. It was a cold that did not come from the temperature, but from something deeper, as if the wood were drawing heat from my body instead of receiving it. I felt the shape of the claws under my fingers as I gripped the armrests. They fit my hands as if they had been carved for them. The moment my back touched the carved backrest, the attic vanished. There was no transition and no intermediate darkness. One instant I was in the attic, and the next, I was somewhere else. It was a highway at night. It was raining heavily and the windshield wipers could not keep up. I was behind the wheel. I recognized my hands on the steering wheel, my fingers, and the small scar I have on the knuckle of my right index finger. The car was going fast, too fast for the rain and the visibility. The headlights bounced off the curtain of water and I could barely see a few yards ahead. The asphalt gleamed with that slippery quality the road gets when it has been raining for hours. The trees on the sides were dark blurs passing at full speed. Then some headlights appeared in front of me. They were headlights coming in the opposite direction, in my lane, getting closer and bigger. I turned the steering wheel, but the tires did not respond. The wet asphalt turned the car into an uncontrollable object sliding toward those lights as if being dragged by a force that had nothing to do with physics. The impact was instantaneous. I felt no pain. There was only a white flash and an absolute silence that lasted a fraction of a second before I returned to the attic. Sitting in the rocking chair, hands gripping the armrests, and my body soaked in a cold sweat that stuck my shirt to my back. I jumped up and went down the stairs so fast I almost fell. I sat on the hallway floor with my back against the wall and my knees to my chest, trying to breathe normally and trying to convince myself that what I had seen was not real, but it had been real. It was as real as the wooden floor under my legs, as real as the sweat running down my temples, and as real as the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I had seen my death. That was what the rocking chair did. It showed you how you were going to die. I did not tell Renata what I had seen. She had not told me the details of her vision beyond the hospital room and the machines. There was a tacit agreement between us not to talk about it, not to give it more importance than it already had, and to go on with our lives as if there were not a piece of furniture upstairs showing the most terrible future a person can know. But the agreement was fragile. It was obvious in the way we avoided walking under the attic trapdoor, taking a detour to the other end of the hallway even though it was longer. It was obvious in the way we turned up the television volume at night so we would not hear the creaking. It was obvious in the way we did not look into the eyes of each other when the sound was louder than usual, as if looking at each other meant acknowledging that we were both listening to the same thing and that we were both afraid. 2 weeks passed. They were 2 weeks in which I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was a hallucination, a product of stress, suggestion, and the dust in the attic. 2 weeks in which I drove slower, avoided highways at night, and found myself looking at the sky every time it started to rain with an anguish that squeezed my chest. 2 weeks in which the nocturnal creaking did not stop for a single night, remaining rhythmic, constant, and patient, like the beating of a heart that was not ours, but was beating inside our house. It was then that I made the mistake that changed everything. I went up to the attic a second time. I do not know why I did it. I want to say it was out of curiosity, out of the need to confirm that the first vision had not been real. But the truth is, I felt an attraction I cannot describe with words. It was as if the rocking chair were calling me, not with a voice or a sound, but with a kind of gravity, as if the center of the house had shifted and was now up there in that dark wooden seat that had been waiting for decades. I sat down and the vision arrived instantly. The same highway, the same rain, the same windshield wipers fighting the water. But this time there was something different. I was not alone in the car. Renata was in the passenger seat. She was sleeping with her head resting on the window. She was wearing the blue jacket I gave her for her birthday. Her hands were on her lap, and she had a peaceful expression on her face, oblivious to what was about to happen. The lights came head-on just like before. The skid was exactly the same. But this time, in the fraction of a second before the white flash, I turned my head and saw the face of Renata. Her eyes snapped open. Her mouth opened. She had an expression of absolute terror the instant she realized what was happening. I saw her hand reach out to me in a gesture that was never completed. And then the white, and then the attic. I returned to the attic screaming. It was not a scream of fright, but a long, deep scream that came from my stomach and made Renata run up the stairs to find me standing next to the rocking chair, trembling, with my eyes bulging and my breath catching in gasps that prevented me from speaking. She hugged me and asked what had happened. I could not tell her. I could not tell her I had seen her death, that the rocking chair had shown me she was going to die with me in that car, on that highway, under that rain. I told her I had felt dizzy, that I had suffered a heat stroke. She looked at the rocking chair, and then at me, and I knew she did not believe me. I saw in her eyes the same question I was asking myself. Why had we sat down again? What force was pushing us toward that wooden seat over and over again? That night, Renata told me something that chilled me to the bone. She told me she had also gone up a second time 3 days ago. She had not told me for the same reason I had not told her my secret. In her second vision, she was no longer alone in the hospital room. I was sitting next to her bed holding her hand. But there was a new detail. There was a window in the room overlooking a parking lot. In the parking lot was a car with a destroyed hood and a broken windshield. It was our car, the one we parked every night in front of the garage. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked if the visions could change. She wondered if every time someone sat in the rocking chair, the death it showed adjusted, modified, and reconfigured itself as if searching for the most terrible, the most probable, or the most inevitable version. I had no answer for her, but I understood something I had refused to accept until that moment. The rocking chair did not show a fixed future. It shaped it. Every time someone sat down, the vision changed because the rocking chair was building something. It was weaving the threads of our death with every rock, with every nocturnal creak, with every vision it forced us to see. And the more times we sat down, the more complete the picture would be. The more details it would have, and the more inevitable it would become. We decided to get rid of it. The next day we went up together wearing work gloves and grabbed it by the armrest to carry it down the stairs. The rocking chair weighed twice as much as a piece of furniture that size should weigh. The wood was warm to the touch despite the gloves, as if it had something alive inside generating heat. We felt the vibration of the wood against our palms, a fine and constant tremor that resembled the pulse of a large animal. We struggled to carry it down step by step, our arms shaking from the effort. We took it out to the garden and left it by the garage door under the gray sky of an afternoon that threatened rain. I called a furniture removal company, and they told me they could come by the next day. That night we slept in silence. There were no creaks. There was no rocking. There was none of that constant rhythm that had been marking the pace of our nights for weeks. The house was at peace for the first time since we had moved in. Renata fell asleep quickly, her face relaxed and her breathing calm. It took me longer, but when sleep caught up with me, it was a deep, dreamless sleep, the likes of which I had not had in a long time. I woke up at 4 in the morning. It was not a noise that woke me. It was the absence of something. It was a change in the temperature of the bedroom, a subtle drop that gave me goosebumps on my arms under the sheets. I opened my eyes and looked toward the door. It was open. And beyond the door, in the hallway, I heard a sound that made my heart stop for a second. A creak, rhythmic, constant. It was not coming from the attic. It was coming from the ground floor, from the living room. I walked down the stairs slowly, my hand on the railing and my bare feet on the cold wood. The moonlight came through the living room window and drew pale rectangles on the floor. And in the middle of the living room, where we had not put it, where it could not be because we had taken it out to the garden less than 8 hours ago, was the rocking chair. It was rocking with a wide and slow movement, as if someone invisible were using it at that very moment. The carved backrest with its intertwined branches cast shadows on the walls that moved with every sway, like long fingers extending and retracting, reaching the corners of the room and retreating with every rock. And the seat, which had been empty every time we had seen it move, had a mark. It was an indentation in the worn wood that was not there before. It was the shape of a body, not the generic shape of someone sitting, but a specific shape with shoulders, with hips, and with the curve of a back that had sunk into the wood as if it had been sitting there for centuries. It was the shape of someone who had been using the rocking chair long before we arrived, and who had no intention of stopping. We never took it out again. We did not try to break it or burn it or give it away. Renata wanted to call someone, a priest, a paranormal expert, anyone who could tell us what to do. But I knew it would be useless. The rocking chair was in the house before us. It had been there for decades, rocking in the attic, waiting. The previous couple had lived with it for 40 years. They had lived with the creaking, the shadows, and whatever that dark wood contained, and they had died. Both of them. One after the other. I wondered if they had sat down too. I wondered if they had seen what we saw. I wondered if they had tried to escape, or if in the end they had accepted the inevitable with the same resignation that was beginning to settle over us like a slow fog. The rocking chair remained in the living room. It rocked every night. sometimes for hours, sometimes just for a few minutes. The creaking became the background noise of our lives, as integrated into our routine as the noise of the boiler or the dripping of the kitchen sink. We did not sit down again. Neither of us did. But every night when I passed through the living room on my way to the bedroom, I felt the attraction. It was that gentle gravity pulling me toward the worn seat, toward the claws of the armrests, and toward the answer to a question I did not want to ask, but found harder to ignore every day. Because the worst thing was not knowing how we were going to die. The worst thing was not knowing if what we saw was already inevitable, or if there was still a version where we survived. And the only way to find out was to sit down one more time. In the end, we failed to realize that the most terrifying traps were not the ones we could not escape from, but the ones we willingly stepped into because the burden of not knowing was heavier than the certainty of our own doom. I always liked analog photography. There was something about the process of loading a roll of film, shooting without seeing the result, and waiting for the development that digital photography could never replicate. It was like writing a letter instead of sending a message. The same content but with a different weight, with a patience that forced me to think about every shot before taking it. I had been collecting antique cameras for years. I bought them at flea markets, thrift stores, and online auctions. I restored and used some of them. I left others on the living room shelf as decorative pieces that told stories of times when a photograph was an event and not an automatic gesture we make 100 times a day with our phones. My apartment had an extra room, a windowless half bathroom that I'd converted into a dark room, an enlarger, chemical trays, a clothesline with wooden clothespins to hang the negatives, and bottles of developer and fixer lined up on a shelf. It was my refuge. It was the only place where time stopped, and there was only the red light, the acidic smell of the chemicals, and the image that emerged from the paper like a ghost deciding to become visible. I found it one October Sunday at a street market set up every weekend in a downtown square. It was a 35mm camera with a black metal body and chrome details, manufactured in the 60s or 70s judging by the design. It had no visible brand. The place where the manufacturer's name should have been engraved was sanded down, as if someone had erased the mark on purpose with sandpaper or a precision tool. The glass lens was clean, without fungus or scratches, which was almost a miracle for a camera of that age. The film advance mechanism worked smoothly, and the shutter made a dry and precise click that I liked from the first moment. The seller was a man in his 60s with ink-stained hands and a table full of objects that looked like they were taken from the house of someone who had just died. There were watches, silver cutlery, yellowed books, and empty picture frames. I asked him where he had gotten the camera. He told me it came from a lot he had bought at an estate sale. He knew nothing else about it. He sold it to me for a price so low it made me suspect it had some defect that was not visible at first glance. I took it home and examined it more closely. I opened the back cover and checked the film compartment. It was empty, but had rust marks on the edges indicating it had held a loaded roll of film for a long time, maybe years, without anyone taking it out or developing it. The optical viewfinder was clean and focused well. The speed ring turned precisely between all positions. Everything worked. I found no defects. The next day, I bought a 36 exposure black and white roll of film at the only analog photography store left in the area and loaded it into the camera. I went for a walk around the neighborhood and took the first photos. I shot streets, facades, a park with trees starting to lose their leaves, a cat asleep on the hood of a car, and a bicycle leaning against a street lamp. They were normal, unpretentious photos, just to prove the camera worked. I developed the roll that same week. I locked myself in the darkroom after dinner with a cup of coffee and the calm concentration of someone who knows they have a couple of hours of pleasant work ahead. I prepared the chemicals, adjusted the water temperature, took the film out of the camera in the dark, and rolled it onto the spiral of the developing tank. The process was always the same. Developer, stop bath, fixer, and wash. Every step had its exact time, and every chemical its precise temperature. When I opened the tank and unrolled the strip of negatives, I held them up to the red light to do an initial inspection. The images looked good, They had clean contrasts, good exposure, and detail in the shadows. I hung them to dry with clothespins and waited for them to be ready to examine with the magnifying glass on the light table. The photos were good. The camera optics produced excellent sharpness and a contrast that gave the images a character that reminded me of mid-20th century photographs. I was satisfied until I reached frame number 14. It was the photo of the park. It showed the trees, the gravel path, and a wooden bench in the background. But on the far right of the image, partially cut off by the edge of the frame, there was a figure. It was a person standing among the trees. I did not remember seeing anyone in that area of the park when I took the photo. I had chosen that angle precisely because it was empty. I enlarged the negative with the magnifying glass. The figure was blurry, as if it had moved during the exposure, or as if it were slightly out of the focal plane. I could not tell if it was a man or a woman. It was just a dark vertical silhouette among the tree trunks. It seemed to be looking towards the camera, but the lack of definition made it impossible to confirm. I checked the previous and subsequent frames. There was nobody in 13 and nobody in 15. It was only in 14. I did not give it much importance. There are people in parks. Someone had probably walked by at the exact moment of the shot, and I had not registered it because I was focused on the framing. I finished reviewing the rest of the negatives. There were no more unexpected figures. I made paper copies of the best photos, including the one from the park, and left them drying on the clothesline in the darkroom. I loaded a second roll of film the next day. This time I went further, to an abandoned industrial area I liked to photograph for its textures and lights. There were empty warehouses with broken glass, brick walls covered in faded graffiti, and puddles of oil that reflected the sky like dirty mirrors. I took the 36 photos throughout the morning, taking my time with each frame, measuring the light carefully, and waiting for the clouds to move to get the contrast I wanted. I was alone during the entire session. I saw nobody. That area had been abandoned for years, and it was not a place where people passed by. I developed the roll that same night. The figure was in 5 of the 36 photos. It was not on the edge of the frame like the first time. It was more centered, deeper inside the composition, as if it had been occupying the space the camera captured with greater confidence. It was still blurry, but less than before. I could tell it was a tall, thin person wearing dark clothes. In one of the photos, it was standing next to a metal door. In another, it appeared at the end of an industrial hallway, silhouetted against the light coming through a broken window. In another, it was sitting on a windowsill, with its legs hanging inside the warehouse. In all of them, it was looking towards the camera. In all of them, it had that diffuse quality that made it impossible to see its features clearly, as if it existed on a slightly different frequency than the rest of the photographed objects. I started to feel something that was not exactly fear but a deep discomfort, like when you know someone is watching you but you cannot locate from where. I examined the negatives with the magnifying glass for hours looking for some technical explanation. It could be a lens defect, an internal reflection, or a problem with the film or the developing chemicals. I tried developing the same negatives with different chemical concentrations and different exposure times. The figure was still there. It was always in the same position, always with the same blurriness, and always looking at the camera. It was not a developing defect. It was on the negative. It was in the image captured by the lens. Whatever appeared in the photos had been there in front of the camera at the moment of the shot. It was invisible to my eyes, but not to the glass of the lens. I shot a third roll. This time, I did not go outside. I photographed the inside of my apartment. I shot the living room, the kitchen, the hallway, and my bedroom. I closed the windows, drew the curtains, and checked that the front door was locked. They were closed spaces where I was completely alone and where it was impossible for another person to be without me seeing them. I took the 36 photos in less than an hour, moving around the apartment and photographing every corner from different angles. Before each shot, I looked through the viewfinder and then pulled my eye away to check the scene directly. There was nothing, just my furniture, my walls, and my objects. I developed the roll with trembling hands and a knot in my stomach that tightened with every negative I took out of the tray. The figure was in 18 of the 36 photos, exactly half. It was no longer blurry. I could see it was a man. He was tall, thin, with short dark hair. He wore a shirt in a color that looked medium gray and black and white, and pants that could be from any era. He had his hands at his sides, with long and thin fingers slightly curved as if they were about to grab something. His face was visible for the first time. He had angular features, sharp cheekbones, and a narrow jaw. But the eyes were what disturbed me the most. They were open and fixed on the camera lens, with an intensity that pierced the paper. It was not the blank stare of someone walking past a camera without realizing it. It was the gaze of someone who knows he is being photographed and wants you to see him. Someone who needs you to see him. In the living room photos, he was standing next to the shelf where I kept the cameras. In the kitchen photos, he was sitting in my chair, in my spot, with his hands on the table as if waiting to be served dinner. In the hallway photos, he was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his head tilted to one side. In my bedroom photos, he was standing next to the bed, looking at the pillow with that expression I was already beginning to recognize. It was patience, expectation, and hunger. In each photo, he was closer to the spot where I had been when I shot. It was as if he were closing the distance between himself and the camera, between himself and my eyes, and between himself and me. I stopped taking photos for 3 days. I put the camera in a closet and tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe the camera had an internal defect that projected an image onto the negative. Maybe the glass of the lens had an impurity that created a pattern my brain interpreted as a human figure. But the photos were too sharp for that. The figure had clothes, it had features, and it had eyes that looked at the lens with intention. It was not a random pattern. It was a person, or something that had been a person. On the 4th day, I did something that terrified me more than any of the previous photos. I took out the paper copies I had made of the first roll, the one with the photos of the park and the streets. I had left them in a folder on the desk. I spread them out on the table and reviewed them one by one. I looked at the photo of the cat on the car hood. When I first developed it, there was nobody else in the image. It was just the cat, the car, and the sidewalk. Now, in the lower left corner, there was a shadow that was not there before. It was not the complete figure. It was just an elongated shadow on the ground, like the one a person standing outside the frame would cast. I looked at the photo of the bicycle next to the street lamp. When I developed it, the background was a plain brick wall. Now, on the wall, there was a mark that looked like the silhouette of a person. It was as if someone had been leaning against the wall and their outline had been printed on the brick like a human-shaped damp stain. I checked all the copies. In 7 of them, there were new elements that were not there when I developed them. There were shadows, marks, and outlines. The figure was not only appearing in the new photos, it was seeping into the old ones. It was going back in time, infiltrating images that already existed, as if it were rewriting the history of each photograph to include itself in it. I needed to know who he was. I needed to know who that camera had belonged to before it reached the street market. I went back to the market the following Sunday and looked for the seller with the ink-stained hands. He was not there. His stall was occupied by another person selling used clothes and imitation bags. I asked the surrounding sellers if they knew the man. One of them, an older woman selling costume jewelry and old coins, told me his name was Osvaldo and that he had been selling at the market for years, but he had not shown up in recent weeks. She did not have his phone number or his address. Another younger seller who sold vinyl records and cassettes told me Osvaldo used to buy estate sale lots, and that most of his items came from the houses of people who had died. He told me that if I wanted to find him, I could try a bar in the old neighborhood where Osvaldo used to drink coffee in the mornings. I went to the bar the next day. It was a narrow place with a zinc bar and walls covered in framed black and white photos. They were photos of the city in past decades, of streets that no longer existed, and of buildings that had been torn down. I asked about Osvaldo, and the bartender looked at me with a strange expression, as if the name was familiar to him, but in a way he did not like. He told me Osvaldo had not shown up for 2 weeks, and that an acquaintance of his had said he was sick, that he was not leaving his house, and that he was not answering the door or the phone. I asked for the address. He did not give it to me, but he told me the street. I went there and asked around the building entrances until a neighbor pointed me to a second-floor door in an old building with a chipped facade. I climbed the stairs and knocked several times. Nobody answered. I pressed my ear to the door and heard a silence that felt inhabited, as if someone were on the other side, motionless, holding their breath. I knocked one more time and said my name. I said I had bought a camera at the street market and needed information. The silence continued. But right before I turned to leave, I heard something on the other side of the door. It was a whisper. It was so low, I barely caught it. It was a single phrase I could not understand, but that sounded like a warning or an apology. I went back to my apartment and made a decision that in hindsight was a mistake, but at the time seemed like the only option. I loaded a fourth roll and took a self-portrait. I placed the camera on a makeshift tripod of books stacked on the living room table, set the timer, and stood in front of the lens. 10 seconds of waiting. The click of the shutter. I repeated the operation 12 times, changing position in the room, sitting in different places, standing by the window and at the hallway door. I wanted to see where the figure appeared in relation to me. I wanted to know how close he had gotten. I developed the roll with a lump in my throat so tight it was hard to swallow. The negatives came out of the tray and I hung them to dry with clothespins, while the smell of the fixer stung my eyes. When they were ready, I examined them with the magnifying glass. The figure appeared in all 12 photos. In all 12, he was standing right behind me, not 3 feet away or a foot away. Right behind me. He was so close his chest almost touched my back. In one of the photos, I could see his right hand raised to the height of my shoulder, with his fingers extended, as if he were about to touch me. In another, the sharpest of all, his face was next to mine, cheek to cheek. I could almost feel the cold that should emanate from that skin that was not skin, from that proximity that existed on paper, but that my senses had not registered at the moment of the shot. His eyes looked at the lens with that intensity I already knew, but now there was something else in his expression. It was something that resembled satisfaction. It was rewarded patience. It was the restrained smile of someone who has been playing a long game and knows he is about to win. I dropped the magnifying glass and took a step back. The dark room was small and the walls seemed to have closed in. The red light of the safe lamp tinted everything a color that looked like diluted blood. I turned around slowly. I knew I was not going to see anything. The figures only existed in the photos. They only existed through the lens of that camera. I turned around and the dark room was empty. It was just me, the trays, the chemicals, and the photos hanging from the clothesline with their wooden pins. But the air was cold. It was a cold that made no sense in such a small and enclosed space where the chemicals maintained a constant temperature. And there was a smell that did not belong to the developer or the fixer. It was an organic, damp smell, like wet dirt or clothes stored for a long time in an unventilated place. It was a smell that reminded me of the basements of old buildings, of rooms that have been closed for years, of spaces where the air has been trapped for so long it has stopped being air and has become something else. I grabbed the camera and put it in a bag. I left home and drove to a bridge that crossed a river on the outskirts. It was night and the road was empty. The lights of the bridge cast orange reflections on the black surface of the water running several yards below with a constant murmur. I parked on the shoulder and walked to the center of the bridge. The wind was cold and damp and hit my face in gusts that smelled of mud and rotting vegetation. I took the camera out of the bag and held it over the railing with my arm extended. I was going to throw it. I was going to get rid of it and forget everything I had seen. My fingers loosened on the metal. The camera tilted towards the void, and in that instant I felt something on the back of my neck. It was a cold breath. It was not a draft or a breeze from the river. It was a breath. It was specific and concentrated, like the one you feel when someone gets too close to your neck from behind. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up as if an electrical charge had run down my spine. I froze. My fingers closed over the camera by instinct. The breath disappeared. I turned around. The bridge was empty. There was nobody there. There was only the asphalt, the railing, the orange lights, and the sound of the water running below. I took the camera home. I did not throw it away. I could not. Something in that breath, in that presence I had felt on the back of my neck, made me understand that getting rid of the camera was not going to do any good. Whatever inhabited that lens, those glasses, that metal and optical mechanism, was no longer just inside the camera. It was outside. It was with me. It had crossed the border separating image from reality, and now occupied the same space as me, breathed the same air, and walked behind me with the same closeness the photos showed. That night I left the camera on the bedroom nightstand and went to bed. I did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the sounds of the apartment. I heard the hum of the refrigerator, the distant dripping of a faucet, and the creaking of the wooden floor contracting with the cold of the night. And among those sounds, there was a new one, a click. It was soft, dry, and metallic. It was the sound of a shutter firing. It came from the nightstand, from the camera. I turned slowly and looked at it. It was there, motionless, with the lens pointing at the ceiling. The film advance turned on its own. It was a brief mechanical sound like a finger turning a page. The camera had taken a photo, on its own, without anyone pressing the shutter button. Every inch of skin on my body broke out in goosebumps. I got out of bed and turned on the light. The camera was still on the nightstand. The frame counter read 1. When I went to bed, it was at 0. The room was empty, but the smell of wet dirt was stronger than ever, and the cold I felt on the back of my neck on the bridge was back, resting on my skin like a hand that could not quite close. I did not touch the camera for 3 days. I left it on the nightstand with the roll inside. With that fired frame I did not dare develop. But on the 3rd day, after 3 nights of sleeping no more than fragments of dreams interrupted by the cold on my neck and the smell of wet dirt appearing and disappearing without a pattern, I opened the camera, took out the roll, and developed it. The frame showed my bedroom. It showed my bed. And in the bed, asleep, was me. The photo was taken from an angle corresponding to someone standing next to the nightstand, looking down, looking at me while I slept. The sharpness was perfect. I could see every wrinkle in the sheet, every lock of hair on the pillow, and the shadow of my eyelashes on my cheekbones. And in the lower corner of the frame, on the very edge of the image, there was a hand. It was a long, thin hand with fine, curved fingers reaching towards my face from outside the frame. It did not quite touch me. It was inches from my cheek, but the direction was clear. The intention was clear. The camera remained in my apartment. I did not keep it on the nightstand. I stored it in the hallway closet, inside a box, inside another box, as if the layers of cardboard could contain what was inside. But every night, I heard the click. Sometimes once, sometimes several times. The shutter fired on its own in the dark, and the film advance turned with that sound of a finger turning pages. I did not open the camera. I did not develop the rolls. They accumulated inside the box like small plastic cylinders containing images I did not want to see, because I knew what was in them. I knew the hand was getting closer. And I knew that one night when I opened my eyes in the darkness, I would no longer need a photograph to see what had been watching me from the other side of the lens. In the end, we often realize too late that the memories we try to capture can sometimes capture us instead, and that some doors, once opened through a simple click, can never be closed again. My name is Darren, and I am 32 years old. I work as a maintenance technician in an office building and live alone in a small apartment that smells of coffee in the mornings and silence at night. This is the story of how a coat stole my life. I found it in a thrift store I entered one November afternoon because it had started to rain and I did not have an umbrella. It was one of those stores occupying a narrow and deep space where clothes hang from metal racks, so tightly packed you have to push the hangers aside with both hands to see what is behind them. It smelled of cheap fabric softener and mothballs, that characteristic smell of garments that have spent a long time stored in closets that are never opened. While waiting for the rain to stop, I looked through the hangers with no intention of buying anything. There were faded plaid shirts, corduroy pants, and wool sweaters with sleeves stretched out from use. It was clothing with a history, with years, and with other people's lives permeated into every fiber. And at the back of the rack, half hidden behind a down coat that had seen better days, there it was. It was a long, dark gray, thick wool coat with a high collar and bone buttons. I took it off the rack and held it in front of me. It was my size. The cut was classic and elegant. The kind of garment you see in old movies about men walking down wet streets with their hands in their pockets and their collars turned up against the wind. The wool was in perfect condition with no visible wear or tear, which was strange for a garment that clearly was decades old. The inside label was cut off. There was only a piece of fabric left where the manufacturer's name should have been, as if someone had wanted to erase its origin. The only thing left was a mark sewn by hand on the inner lining next to the left pocket. It was a letter. It was a single letter embroidered in black thread on the gray lining, the letter N. I tried it on in front of a mirror at the back of the store, an old mirror with rust spots on the edges that gave the reflection an ancient quality, as if I were looking at myself from another era. The coat fit me as if it had been custom made. The shoulders fell in the exact spot, the sleeves were the right length, and the waist was fitted without being tight. I ran my hands over the lapels and noticed the density of the wool under my fingers, that compact and soft texture that only clothes made with real materials have, without synthetic blends or production shortcuts. The clerk, a gray-haired woman reading a magazine behind the counter, told me it had been hanging there for months and nobody had wanted it. She could not tell me where it came from or who had brought it. She sold it to me for a ridiculous price, and I left the store wearing it, with the collar turned up against the rain, and a feeling of satisfaction I had not felt in a long time for something as simple as a piece of clothing. The first borrowed memory appeared that same night. I was lying in bed about to fall asleep with the coat hanging on the bedroom door hanger when I saw something. It was not a dream. It was an image that appeared behind my closed eyelids with the clarity of a photograph. It was a kitchen that was not mine. It had white tiles with a blue border. There was a wooden table with an oilcloth tablecloth. There was a window letting in afternoon light that bathed everything in a golden color that looked like liquid. I could smell something. It was hot food, something with spices, a stew or a soup bubbling somewhere outside the frame of that image. The vision lasted 2 or 3 seconds and disappeared. I opened my eyes and looked at my bedroom ceiling. Everything was normal, and everything was in its place. I closed my eyes again, and the image did not return. I fell asleep thinking it had been one of those visions that sometimes appear on the threshold of sleep, random fragments the brain projects while shutting down. The next day, I wore the coat to work. It was cold, and the thick wool kept the heat in a way none of my other jackets could. During the morning, while checking the 4th floor ventilation system, I had another flash. This time, it was not a static image. It was a short sequence like a movie clip. Hands that were not mine opened a dark wooden door. There was a long hallway with a gray tile floor. At the end of the hallway, there were stairs leading down to a basement illuminated by a bare bulb swinging in a slow and hypnotic motion. The sequence cut off abruptly, and I found myself standing in the ventilation room with the wrench in my hand and my heart racing. I looked around. Everything was real. The air ducts, the machines, and the hum of the climate control system were all there. But the hands I had seen opening that door were as real as mine. I could feel the texture of the wood on my fingertips, the cold of the metal knob and the creak of the hinges. They were not my hands. They were larger, with wider knuckles and shorter nails. They were the hands of someone who worked with them, hands that knew the weight of tools and the resistance of materials. The flashes became more frequent throughout the week. It always happened when I was wearing the coat. They were always brief, always clear, and always with that quality of a lived memory that differentiated them from a dream or a fantasy. I saw an auto repair shop with old cars on hydraulic lifts. The floor was stained with oil and smelled of hot grease and solvent. The tools hung from a metal panel on the wall, organized by size, each on its hook, with the precision of someone who knows the value of each piece and does not tolerate mess. I saw a hotel room with thick curtains and an unmade bed, the sheets tangled as if whoever had slept there had gotten up in a hurry or in anger. I saw a large dog with dark and shiny hair running through a field of tall grass, chasing something I could not see, with its ears flattened by the wind and its tongue hanging out. I felt the joy of that animal as if it were my own, a burst of pure and uncomplicated happiness that left me with wet eyes when the vision faded. I saw the same white-tiled kitchen, but this time from another angle. Sitting at the table with a plate of food in front of me and a radio on playing a song I did not recognize, but that stuck in my head for hours, a melody I hummed without realizing it while walking down the hallways of the office building. Every image was accompanied by physical sensations that did not belong to me. The smell of engine grease, the touch of rough sheets, the taste of overly bitter coffee, and the warmth of the sun on the back of my neck while a breeze moved the field grass. It took me a while to establish the connection with the coat because I did not want to see it. It is easy to ignore a pattern when acknowledging it means accepting something that does not fit into your way of understanding the world. But one Saturday morning I took off the coat when I got home from grocery shopping and hung it on the entryway coat rack. The flashes stopped. I spent the rest of the day without a single borrowed image, without a single memory that was not mine. The apartment became just my apartment again, with my walls, my furniture, and my smells. On Sunday, I did not leave the house, and I did not put on the coat. There was nothing, just absolute mental silence. On Monday, I put it on to go to work, and before reaching the bus stop, I had already seen 3 new images. I saw a cobblestone street in the rain with the stones shining like the scales of a huge animal. I saw a storefront with broken glass and mannequins lying inside like lifeless bodies. And I saw a woman from behind with long blonde hair walking down a hallway that looked like the one from the first vision. The woman stopped at the end of the hallway and started to turn around, but the image cut off before I could see her face. I stood there holding the bus pole with a knot in my stomach, feeling like I was about to see something I did not want to see but could no longer avoid. I should have stopped wearing it. I should have gone back to the thrift store and returned it or thrown it in a dumpster. But the memories had something addictive about them. They were windows into a life that was not mine, but that I felt with an intensity my own life lacked. My routine was predictable, comfortable, and gray. It was just home, work, the supermarket, and home. I saw the same streets, the same hallways, and the same faces. The memories from the coat were something else. They were vivid, emotional, and loaded with a sensory density that made everything else seem pale in comparison. I wanted to see more. I wanted to know whose life that was. I wanted to know who N was. The visions became longer and more detailed. They were no longer 2 or 3 second flashes. They lasted half a minute and sometimes more. And they started to have a sequence, a narrative thread connecting them like pieces of a puzzle someone was putting together inside my head. The auto repair shop belonged to a man the memories called Niels. The large hands were his. The white-tiled kitchen was his kitchen. The blonde woman was his wife. The dog was his dog, a Belgian shepherd named Bruno with honey-colored eyes who followed Niels everywhere with unconditional devotion. I slowly reconstructed the life of Niels from the fragments the coat gave me. He worked as a mechanic in his own shop. He lived in a house with a garden on the outskirts of some town I could never identify. He had a wife he loved with that quiet devotion of men who express love with actions instead of words. He liked bitter coffee and the old songs that played on the radio while he ate dinner. On Sundays, he took Bruno to the field and let him run until the dog came back with his tongue hanging out and lay at his feet panting with happiness. But the memories did not stay on the bright side. Little by little, they began to darken, as if the coat had been dosing the information, showing me the good stuff first to hook me before showing me what it really wanted me to see. The kitchen images started to include details that were not there before. There was a broken plate on the floor next to the table leg. There was an overturned chair against the wall. There were marks on the white tiles that looked like impacts and cracks in the blue border like stars of broken glass. The blonde woman stopped appearing from behind, and I started seeing her from the front. She had swollen and red eyes and an expression I recognized instantly because I had seen it before on other faces, in documentaries, and in photographs illustrating articles nobody wants to read. It was fear. It was not a specific fear, but a chronic fear, settled in the bones, manifesting in the way she lowered her gaze and shrank away when someone raised their voice or made a sudden movement. The repair shop memories also changed. I saw Niels yelling at a young apprentice who cowered against the wall with his hands raised. I saw his large hands closing into fists so tight the knuckles turned white. I saw the way the atmosphere changed when he entered a room, how the air grew heavier and the people around him became smaller, quieter, and more careful with every word and every gesture. I tried to stop wearing the coat. I hung it in the bedroom closet and closed the door. I lasted 2 days. They were 2 days in which I told myself I did not need that garment, that I had other coats, and that the November cold was no excuse to keep dressing in the skin of a man whose life made me nauseous. On the 3rd day, I took it out of the closet and put it on with the excuse that it was cold, and I had no other garment as warm. The excuse was a lie. and I knew it. What I wanted was to feel the wool against my shoulders and have the memories return. And they returned instantly, more intense than ever, as if the coat had punished me for my absence with a larger dose. I saw the inside of the house of Niels with a level of detail I had not reached before. I saw the gray tile hallway with a flickering wall lamp. I saw the basement stairs with worn wooden steps that creaked under a weight they knew well. I saw the bedroom door with a lock on the outside. A lock that should not be there because bedroom locks go on the inside to protect the sleeper, not to lock them in. I saw the blonde woman sitting on the kitchen floor with her knees to her chest and her back against the white tiled wall, staring at a spot on the floor that was not special, but was the only safe place to rest her eyes. I saw things I do not want to describe in detail because doing so would give them a permanence they do not deserve. What I saw was the story of a man who destroyed everything close to him with the same ease with which he repaired engines, with the same hands, with the same precision. But the worst part was not the visions. The worst part was what was happening to me. The memories of Niels were starting to mix with mine. At first, they were small confusions I could attribute to fatigue or distraction. I would walk into my kitchen and for a fraction of a second, I would see the white tiles with the blue border instead of my cream-colored walls. I would look at my hands while washing dishes and see them larger, with wider knuckles, short nails, and fingers stained with grease that did not exist. One day at work, a coworker, a guy named Colin who always made jokes, made a comment to me about a mistake I'd made with the heating system. The joke was innocent, the kind of comment anyone would receive with a smile or indifference, but what I felt was a wave of fury that did not belong to me. It was a hot rage that rose from my stomach to my jaw and made me clench my fists so tightly my nails left marks on my palms. I saw the face of Colin, and for an instant I did not see Colin. I saw the shop apprentice. I saw someone who dared to mock me and who needed to learn not to do so. I said nothing. I did nothing. But I was scared. That rage was not mine. I am not a violent person. I never have been. But for an instant, during the 3 or 4 seconds that wave lasted, I knew exactly how Niels felt when he clenched his fists. And the part that terrified me the most was that it did not feel bad. It felt powerful. It felt alive in a way that made everything else seem to be asleep. The boundaries between Niels and me began to blur in ways I had trouble detecting in time. I found myself drinking my coffee without sugar when I had always taken it with 2 spoons. I caught myself humming a song I did not know, but that the kitchen radio of Niels played every afternoon, a melancholic accordion melody that did not belong to any station I listened to. One night I dreamed of Bruno, the dog, running through the tall grass field with the sun on his back, and I woke up with a deep sadness and a feeling of loss that made no sense because I had never owned a dog. But the sadness was real. The tears running down my face were real. The emptiness in my chest was real. They were the emotions of Niels, not mine, but my body did not know the difference. And with every passing day, the difference grew smaller. I went to the thrift store. I needed to know where that coat had come from. The gray-haired woman was still behind the counter with her magazine, the same magazine or an identical one, as if time did not pass inside that store. I asked her who had brought the gray coat. She told me she did not remember exactly, that the store received dozens of bags of clothes every week, and they did not always record the source. But she searched through a notebook she had under the counter, a blue-covered notebook with pages full of handwritten notes, and found an entry that matched the approximate date. The clothes had been donated by a charity association in charge of emptying the homes of deceased people who had no relatives or whose relatives did not want to take care of their belongings. There was no name for the deceased, only a reference number and the name of the association. I asked for that information, and she gave it to me. I called the association the next day. A woman with a kind voice told me she could not give me information about the deceased for privacy reasons. I explained that I just needed to know if the coat had belonged to someone whose name started with N. I told her I did not want an address or a cause of death or any personal data, just a name. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she told me she would check the registry and call me back. She did not call me. I called 3 days later, and another person answered, telling me they could not find the reference number I had given them. He said it had probably been a mistake in the store records, and they could not help me. I insisted. He told me in a sharper tone that they did not have that information and could not dedicate more time to my inquiry. The conversation ended there, but I no longer needed anyone to confirm who Niels was. I knew it. I felt it in every fiber of that coat that clung to my body as if it were my own skin. Every time I put it on, his life overlapped with mine like a fresh coat of paint over an old wall. And the new paint was thicker, darker, and more resilient. My memories began to fade. Small things at first. The name of the street where I grew up. The color of the walls in my childhood bedroom. The face of my mother when she was young. They did not disappear entirely. They became blurry, like photographs someone had submerged in water that dissolved slowly while I watched helplessly. And in their place appeared the memories of Niels, clear and bright with that sensory intensity that made my own memories seem like faded copies of something that was never quite real. I took off the coat one December morning with the intention of never wearing it again. I put it in a black trash bag, tied the knot tightly, and left it by the street dumpster. I went up to my apartment and sat on the couch. The memories of Niels did not stop. They kept coming, slower and blurrier, like a dripping faucet after you turn it off. But they were still there. The white-tiled kitchen, the large hands, the blonde woman with her look of chronic fear, the repair shop with its elevated cars and its smell of grease that was already more familiar to me than the smell of my own apartment. I went down to the street 2 hours later. The trash bag was still by the dumpster. I opened it. The coat was inside, folded just as I had left it. The gray wool looked up at me from the darkness of the bag like an animal that knows its owner is coming back. I took it out and put it on. The memories returned at full power, like a dam opening, like a river regaining its course after a drought. And I felt relief. It was a relief that ashamed me because it meant I could no longer do without that foreign life, that I needed it more than my own. That was 3 months ago. The coat hangs on my bedroom door hanger every night, and I put it on every morning before leaving. The memories of Niels are no longer interruptions in my daily life. They are my daily life. I know his house better than mine. I know his hands better than mine. I know his emotions, his routines, and his dark impulses with an intimacy that makes me nauseous but from which I cannot detach myself. Yesterday something happened to me that forced me to sit on the bathroom floor for an hour with my head between my knees and my hands covering my face. I was at the supermarket grocery shopping while wearing the coat. A woman walked past me in the dairy aisle. She had long blonde hair. She was not the same woman from the memories. She was younger with different features and a different build, but her hair was the same shade and fell the same way over her shoulders. And when I saw her, I felt something that was not mine. It was an impulse coming from a deep and ancient place, from a corner of the mind that did not belong to me, but that occupied more space inside my head every day. It was an instant. Just an instant. But in that instant, I knew exactly what Niels would have thought upon seeing that woman. I knew what he would have wanted to do. I knew what he probably did to his own wife. I left the supermarket without buying anything. I got home and took off the coat with trembling hands. I threw it on the hallway floor and locked myself in the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, searching for my face, my expression, and my eyes. Everything was still there. My face was still my face. My eyes were still my eyes. But there was something behind them that was not there before. A shadow, a presence. It was as if someone were looking through my pupils from a place that has no name. It was as if Niels had found a way to peer into the world through me. The coat is still in the hallway, lying where I left it. I have not picked it up. I have not put it on again. I have not touched it for 2 days, and the memories of Niels keep coming, weaker and weaker, like a signal losing power with distance. But every time I walk past it, I feel the thick wool calling me with the same silent voice that called me that first November afternoon in the thrift store. And every time it gets a little harder not to answer. Because what scares me the most is not what the coat shows me. What scares me the most is that a part of me, a part that grows every day and that has larger hands and wider knuckles than mine, no longer wants it to stop. In the end, we fail to realize that the monsters we invite in out of curiosity do not just haunt our homes, they patiently wait to wear our skin as their own. I did not expect any deliveries that November afternoon. I had not bought anything online for weeks, and I did not remember ordering anything I might have forgotten about. However, when I went down to the lobby after lunch, there it was, a brown cardboard package with no return address, with my name and address written by hand in black ink. The handwriting was strange, slanted to the left, as if whoever wrote it was left-handed, or was making an effort to disguise their writing. I took it up to the apartment without giving it much thought. Sometimes online stores sent promotional products or free samples. I thought it would be something like that. I left the box on the kitchen table and opened it with scissors. Inside, wrapped in several layers of old newspaper, there was a porcelain doll. It was about 12 inches tall. It had dark straight hair glued to its head as if it were painted directly on the porcelain. It wore a white dress with lace on the edges, yellowed by the passage of time. The shoes were black and tiny, with a buckled detail, but what caught my attention were the eyes. They were made of glass, a very light blue, almost transparent, and they had a quality that was difficult for me to define at that moment. They did not look straight ahead blankly like most antique dolls. They seemed focused. It was as if there was something behind them watching carefully. I looked inside the package for a note, a packing slip, or an explanation. There was nothing, just the newspaper and the doll. I checked the newspapers to see if I could find a date or a clue. They were in a language I did not recognize. The letters looked like some Eastern European alphabet, but I could not be sure. I left the doll on the kitchen counter and threw the cardboard and paper in the trash. I thought about calling the courier company to ask who had sent that, but in the end I let it go. I had pending work, and an old doll was not exactly a priority. That night I stayed up late reviewing documents in the office I had set up in the room next to the living room. My apartment was not big, just 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen open to the living room. I had been living alone for 3 years after a divorce I prefer not to remember in detail. Solitude had become something comfortable, a routine that protected me from the emotional noise I had always found hard to manage. Around 2 in the morning, I turned off the computer and went to the kitchen to drink a glass of water before going to bed. The doll was still on the counter where I had left it. But something had changed. I was sure I had left it facing the window, because I remember placing it carelessly without thinking, and the window was right in front of it. Now it was facing the hallway, looking towards my bedroom door. I stood still for a few seconds with the glass in my hand. Then I shook my head, thinking I had probably left it in another position and just did not remember. Fatigue was playing tricks on me. I drank the water, left the glass in the sink, and went to sleep. It took me longer than usual to fall asleep. I kept thinking about those blue glass eyes and the way they seemed focused on something specific. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of long, dark hallways, and I do not remember much else. The next morning, I made a decision. I did not want that doll in my house. I was not superstitious, and I did not believe in curses or anything like that. But the object gave me an uncomfortable feeling I could not explain with words. It was like having someone else in the apartment, a silent presence that took up space even if it did not move. I put it in a plastic bag and took it down to the dumpster on the corner. I threw it away among garbage bags and cardboard scraps. I went back home and made myself a coffee, feeling the matter was resolved. That afternoon when I returned from work, the doll was on my front doormat. It was inside the same plastic bag I had put it in. I felt a chill run down my spine from the back of my neck to my waist. I crouched down and looked both ways down the hallway. There was nobody there. The building was quiet, with 4 floors and 2 apartments per floor. My neighbors were older people, retired couples, and a young woman who worked at a hospital and was barely home. None of them had any reason to dig through the trash and return a doll to my door. I picked up the bag and went into the apartment. I took the doll out and examined it more closely. It was exactly the same, with the white dress, the black shoes, and the fixed blue eyes. I left it on the living room table and sat across from it trying to think logically. Someone was playing a prank on me. Maybe a neighbor had seen me throw it away and picked it up thinking it was a mistake. Or maybe an acquaintance had sent it as a gift and was waiting for me to thank them. I called my brother, 2 close friends, and my ex-wife, but nobody knew anything about any doll. The next day I threw it away differently. I put it in an old backpack I no longer used and took it to work with me. At lunchtime, I left the office and walked to a park that was about 10 blocks away. There were large industrial dumpsters there, the kind used for construction sites. I put the backpack with the doll inside and covered it with rubble and dry paint scraps. Nobody saw me, and nobody could know I had left something there. I went back to the office with a feeling of relief that almost made me smile. The relief lasted until 9 at night. When I opened my apartment door and turned on the hall light, the doll was on the floor of the hallway. It was not in a bag, and it was not in the backpack. It was directly on the floor, sitting with its back against the wall, looking at me. The blue glass eyes pointed directly at the door, as if it had been waiting for me, as if it knew exactly what time I was going to arrive. The backpack was nowhere to be found. It was hard for me to go inside. I stood in the doorway for almost a minute, keys in hand and my heart pounding against my ribs. The apartment was silent, and everything seemed in order, except for that porcelain figure sitting in my hallway. I entered slowly, turned on all the lights and checked every room. The windows were closed and the door had no signs of forced entry. Nobody had entered, or at least nobody had left a trace of having done so. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the doll on the table in front of me and tried to reason. There was a logical explanation for all this, as there always is. Maybe I was taking the doll out of the house myself and then bringing it back in a state of distraction or some kind of sleepwalking. I had read about cases like that where people do things during the night with no memory upon waking. The theory did not convince me, but it was better than the alternative. The alternative was accepting that a porcelain doll was returning to my house on its own, and that was something my rational mind refused to process. On the fourth day, I decided to try something different. I marked the doll. With a black marker, I drew a small cross on the sole of the left shoe. If the doll that appeared was the same one, it would have the mark. If it did not have it, that meant someone was replacing it, that there was more than one, and that everything was an elaborate bad joke. That afternoon, I drove it to an industrial area on the outskirts. I drove for 40 minutes. I parked next to some abandoned warehouses and left the doll inside a rusty metal drum lying next to a fence. I drove back home slowly, checking the back seat and the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I arrived at the apartment, I searched every corner before sitting down. There was nothing. The doll was not there. I prepared dinner with something resembling peace of mind and sat down to eat while watching television. Around 11, I started to fall asleep on the couch. I got up to go to the bathroom before going to bed. I opened the bathroom door and turned on the light. The doll was inside the bathtub. It was lying on its back with its eyes looking at the ceiling, and the white dress was spread out on the surface of the bathtub as if someone had placed it there carefully. I kneeled next to the bathtub with trembling hands. I turned it over and looked at the sole of the left shoe. The black marker cross was there. It was the same doll I had left a 40-minute drive away inside a rusty drum in an abandoned industrial area. The fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. It was not the sudden fear of a scare. It was something slower, deeper, and colder. It was the certainty that something was happening, and that I had no control over it. I sat on the bathroom floor with the doll in my hands and looked at it for a long time. The glass eyes stared back at me with that expression I was already starting to recognize. It was not empty, and it was not neutral. It was patient. It was as if the doll had all the time in the world and knew I would not be able to get rid of it. I spent the next few days looking for information. I researched the doll on antique forums, collector websites, and groups specializing in Victorian objects. I spent hours in front of the screen comparing photographs, reading descriptions from old catalogs, and reviewing closed auctions from the last 10 years. I found nothing that matched its exact description, with the white lace dress, the light blue glass eyes, and the hair painted directly on the porcelain. There were thousands of similar dolls, but none exactly like it. I uploaded photos to several forums asking if anyone recognized it. I received vague answers, suggestions of brands that led nowhere, and a few mocking comments from people who thought I was trying to sell something. That was until a user with a name I do not remember sent me a private message. He asked me where I had gotten it, and I told him it had been sent to me with no return address. His answer was brief. He told me he had seen an identical doll in a photograph from the 1930s in a crime archive from an Eastern European region. The photograph accompanied the news of a family that had been found dead in their home, with no signs of violence and no medical explanation. They had all died in their sleep. In the photograph taken by the police, the doll was sitting on a chair next to the bed of the couple. I tried to get more information from that user, but he never replied again. His profile disappeared from the forum 2 days later, as if he had never existed. I searched for the news he mentioned on my own, but I found nothing. Without the correct language and without knowing the exact region, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. What I did find on a different forum was the testimony of a woman who claimed to have had a similar experience with an object she received in the mail. It was not a doll in her case, but a carved wooden box. She said she could not get rid of it, that it always came back, and that over time she started noticing changes in her house. They were subtle things like the smell of a room changing, marks on the walls that were not there before, and shadows in the corners that did not correspond to any object. The woman said that in the end she stopped trying to get rid of the box and simply accepted it as part of her life. Her last message on the forum was dated 4 years ago, and she had not posted anything since. That information, far from reassuring me, made the fear grow, because I started noticing exactly the same things that woman described. The smell of my apartment changed. It was not a drastic change, but rather a background note that had not been there before. It was a sweet smell, like dried flowers or old perfume. It appeared mostly at night when the apartment was silent, and the shadows were the worst. I started seeing shapes in the corners of the rooms that did not match the furniture. They were faint, almost imperceptible, and they disappeared when I turned on more lights or looked at them directly. But they were there on the periphery of my vision, at the edges of my visual field, like figures that stepped aside right before I could focus on them. The doll, meanwhile, followed its own pattern. I no longer tried to get rid of it because I had accepted that I could not. I left it on the living room shelf, always in the same place, always facing the wall. But every morning I found it in a different spot. One day it was on the kitchen chair, another day on the bedroom windowsill, another day on the bathroom floor right in front of the door, as if it had been about to leave. And always, without exception, it was closer to where I slept than the day before. I mentally tracked the positions from the living room to the kitchen, the hallway, the bathroom, and the bedroom door. The progression was clear. It was getting closer. I started sleeping poorly. I would wake up several times during the night with the feeling that someone was watching me from the darkness. I would turn on the bedside lamp and check the room. The doll was never inside the bedroom when I woke up, but every morning it appeared a little closer to the door. 1 inch, 2 inches, half a handspan. It was as if it advanced during the hours I managed to sleep. The insomnia started to affect my work. I arrived at the office with deep, dark circles under my eyes, unable to concentrate. My coworkers asked me if I was okay, and I told them I was, that it was just stress. I could not tell them the truth. I could not tell anyone that a porcelain doll was moving around my apartment on its own, and that every night it got a little closer to where I slept. Nobody would have believed me. I would not have believed it myself if I were not living it. One night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up with the sweet smell stronger than ever. It was so intense I could almost taste it. I turned on the lamp and looked towards the bedroom door. It was open. I always closed it before going to bed. I had developed that habit since the doll started moving, closing the door and putting a chair against the knob. That night the door was open and the chair was pushed aside, and on the threshold, in the space between the hallway and my room, was the doll. It was standing up. It was not sitting, not lying down, and not leaning against the wall. It was standing upright on its small black shoes, with its blue glass eyes looking directly at me. Porcelain dolls do not stand on their own. Their feet are too small and their center of gravity is too high. But there it was. It was perfect and motionless, defying physics with the same naturalness with which it defied everything else. The hallway light came from behind it and cast a long shadow that stretched to the foot of my bed. It was a shadow that was too big for a 12-inch object, a shadow that seemed to belong to something much taller, much older, and much more real than a simple porcelain figure. I did not scream and I did not move. I sat in bed with my back against the headboard and my eyes fixed on that figure that had crossed the final frontier. It had entered my bedroom. This was the space I considered safe. the only place in the apartment where I still felt I had some control. I stayed like that until dawn. I did not take my eyes off the doll for a single second, and it did not take its eyes off me either. In the daylight, I did something I should have done from the beginning. I called a locksmith and changed the lock. I installed a security camera in the living room and another in the hallway. If something moved during the night, it would be recorded. I placed the doll on the living room shelf in front of the camera and made sure the angle covered the entire area. That night, I checked 3 times that the cameras were recording before going to bed. I woke up at 4 in the morning. The sweet smell had woken me up. I turned on the light. The bedroom door was open and the doll was next to my bed. It was on the nightstand, less than 2 feet from my face. The blue glass eyes looked at me from a distance where I could see every detail. I could see the small veins of the painted iris, the tiny eyelashes, and the line of the mouth slightly curved upwards in something that was not exactly a smile, but was close enough to freeze my blood. I jumped up and went straight to the living room. I turned on the computer and opened the camera recordings. I checked the living room video first. The shelf was visible, and the doll was in the place I had left it. At 1:43 in the morning, the recording cut out. There was no interference, no noise, and no distortion. The image simply froze for 26 minutes. When it resumed, the doll was no longer on the shelf. The hallway camera showed exactly the same thing. It showed a normal recording until 1:43, a 26-minute freeze, and then resumed with an empty hallway. Nothing entered or left the field of vision. The doll simply stopped being in one place and appeared in another. I checked the video files with editing software to make sure they had not been tampered with. The metadata was consistent, and there were no cuts or edits. The cameras had functioned normally except during those 26 minutes when the image had stopped, as if time itself had paused. I did not go to work that morning. I sat on the couch and thought about my options. I could not throw the doll away because it came back. I could not watch it because the cameras failed. I could not lock it up because it opened doors. I could not move it away because it crossed any distance to return. Every night it got closer. First the living room, then the hallway, then the bedroom door, then inside the bedroom, then the nightstand. The progression was mathematical, predictable, and relentless. If it kept going like this, the next stop would be the pillow. And after the pillow, I did not know what would come. I did not want to know, but the image of that Eastern European family, found dead in their beds with no signs of violence, came to my mind every time I closed my eyes. I made a drastic decision. I packed a suitcase with the essentials, put the doll in a shoebox and drove to the house of my mother, which was 2 hours away. I was not going to leave the doll alone in the apartment. I feared that if I left it, it would appear wherever I was, so I took it with me. During the trip, the box was on the passenger seat. Every few minutes I looked at it out of the corner of my eye, as if I expected the lid to move or some sound to come from inside. The road was empty at that hour, and the silence of the car amplified every small noise. The crunch of the cardboard with the engine vibrations and the brushing of the box against the seat fabric on the curves were normal sounds I would not have noticed in any other context. But that night they made my skin crawl. The idea was to tell my mother everything and ask for her advice. My mother was a practical woman, the kind who always finds a solution to problems. But when I arrived at her house and opened the box to show her the doll, I saw something that made me take a step back. The expression on the doll had changed. It was not obvious. It was not that it smiled or frowned. It was something in the eyes, the direction of the gaze. Since I had it in my possession, the eyes had always looked at me. Always. No matter where I put it or how I positioned it, when I looked at it again, the eyes were fixed on me. But at that moment, for the first time, the doll was not looking at me. It was looking at my mother. I closed the box forcefully. I told my mother I'd brought the wrong box, that it was a gift for a coworker, and that I had brought it by mistake. My mother looked at me with that expression mothers have when they know you are lying to them, but decide not to push it. She offered me a coffee and asked if I was sleeping well, because I looked bad. I told her I was, that it was just work. I put the box in the trunk of the car and said goodbye with a clumsy excuse. I could not leave that thing near my mother, and I could not leave it near anyone. I drove back to my apartment with the box in the back seat and the doll inside. its blue glass eyes looking through the cardboard as if the walls did not exist. That night I did something I had not done since I was a child. I prayed. I do not know to whom or to what, but I prayed. I sat on the living room floor with the doll in front of me and asked whatever was listening for this to end. I asked it to leave me alone, to take the doll away, or to at least explain what it wanted from me. The silence that followed was the most absolute I have heard in my life. It was a silence that seemed to have weight, that pressed on my eardrums, and that filled the room like a thick liquid. And in the middle of that silence, sitting on the floor of my own living room, I felt something that completely paralyzed me. A small, cold porcelain hand grazing my fingers. I looked down. The doll was exactly where I had left it, almost 3 feet away. Its hands rested on the white dress, motionless. But the sensation on my fingers took several seconds to disappear. It was a damp cold, like touching a stone that has spent the night outdoors. It was a cold that did not belong to my apartment or to any object I could see. I never tried to get rid of it again. I never moved it from its place again. I never investigated its origin again. I accepted its presence like someone who accepts a chronic illness, something that is there and is not going away. Something you have to learn to live with even if it consumes you from the inside. The doll is still in my apartment. I leave it on the living room shelf every night, and every morning I find it in a different place. Sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes next to my bed. I no longer get scared when I see it. I no longer jump, but I also do not sleep more than 3 or 4 hours at a time. The sweet smell has become permanent, an invisible layer that permeates every corner of the apartment. The shadows in the corners no longer hide. They no longer step aside when I look at them. They stay there blurry, dark, and patient, just like the doll itself. Sometimes, when I'm about to fall asleep, I feel that small, cold hand brushing against my face. And every time it is a little closer. In the end, we often learn that some burdens cannot be cast away or outrun, and true horror lies not in the unknown, but in the quiet, inevitable acceptance of the darkness that decides to make its home with us.